My name's Amy McDonald. I'm the director of CitySpace. Sir Simon Schama is one of the most well-known historians writing about French, Dutch, British, and American history. He is well known for his BBC TV series. Simon Schama's latest book is, I just lost my place. I wanted to say something first. Known for his BBC TV series, The Power of Art and the American Future History. He is University Professor of History and Art History at Columbia University. And you may not know he is a huge Red Sox fan. His newest book, Foreign Bodies, Pandemic, Vaccines, and the Health of Nations, could not be more timely. I encourage you to buy a copy. After the conversation, our partners, Brookline Booksmith, is selling his book in our lobby. Our moderator this evening is WBUR's senior health and science reporter, Gabrielle Emanuel. We will be taking questions throughout the hour. Just go to slido.com and type in #Schama. Please welcome Gabrielle Emanuel and Simon Schama.
Wonderful. It's good to be here. First of all, congratulations. The book is beautifully woven together, and what amazing characters to have found and brought back to life. I wanted to structure our conversation tonight around a couple different themes. First, I was hoping we could learn more about how this book came into existence and about the research process. And then I wanted to move to the meat of the story, and then finally kind of bringing it up to today, talking about the politics. But if we could start...
It's the thing about Boston, everybody is so well organized, you know. In New York, we just shout at each other, really. And if you're a New York Jew like me, you proceed by agreed mutual interruption, you know, which is really...
That can go here, too.
Doubt it.
But when I think about you and your expertise, I think about art history, Dutch history, British history, but vaccines and pandemics is not what comes to mind. So tell me, how did this story come to be?
Well, it's interesting, actually, and this is not something that's occurred to me till this minute. I had a kind of, biological sideline at school. I mean, the one thing, I was terrible at physics and chemistry and all the really hardcore logically thought out sciences, but I did actually love zoology, and it was put to the test by a fantastic teacher called, with a wonderful name that almost feels it was invented by some writer of Arnold Bennett or someone, not British novels, called Theodore Savery. Theodore Savery was Britain, if not the world's greatest arachnologist, Spider-Man. You got yourself sorted out after an invitation to the home of Theodore Savery, in which a very large room, not quite as big as this, but probably, a quarter of the size, with a glazed-in area, was filled with probably 5,000 spiders. Oh. And you're screaming, and my wife, who's afraid of nothing, is terrified of spiders, and I loved it, actually. So biology was the route not taken, but I do have a wife who was a geneticist of embryology, developmental embryologist. Anyway, the story really is a lockdown story, as it is. You're probably all tired of hearing lockdown stories, but it was very interesting. I think, actually, fellow writers I talked to either wanted, as a kind of source of creative comfort, to really work with something they'd kind of already know, but hadn't been so imprisoned, and this forced them to kind of write it all out. Or they had a kind of weirdly, again, boyish or girlish instinct of going back to school and wanting to learn something new. In millions of cases, it was how to bake sourdough bread, or it could have been something, more. And I started in category 1 and then moved to category 2. My publishers were very much expecting a book called Return of the Tribes about the culture of ultra-nationalism, called populist nationalism, which is what I've been writing about national allegiance in one guise or another. The French Revolution book turned into something about what it meant to be French, and the Dutch books were all about that kind of thing too. But this was going to be about, for example, what happened to music in the 19th century in the hands of Glinka and Sibelius and Elgar and so on, and painting, and I got very interested in Kosovo. And so I was sort of toiling on this with the sense of knowing, that as I started writing this book, and I did start writing it, it all felt, I don't know, routine in some weird way, odd way. Anyway, I was looking for some moment where nationalism was not weaponized for whatever reasons. And I thought, the founding of the World Health Organization, whatever one feels about it, had to be one of those moments. So I went to, we were all locked down, to their website, and it was one of those moments. It was the first specialized agency of the United Nations to be created in San Francisco in 1948 by, very interestingly, this was going to be a chapter in the book and had to be cut, by 2 diplomats, one Chinese and one Norwegian. But it came with a very interesting and quite sophisticated online archive, one of which introduced me to something I'd never heard of, called with the appealing title of the International Sanitary Conferences, which were founded in 1851 to deal with cholera. And I was just, and I discovered, we can have the first slide, when I, if we can, thank you. I discovered this was a man who did not found these conferences. They were the first organization of any international discussion that was not simply about a military alliance or a peace treaty. They were about something where nations, usually at war with each other, knew, in the case of cholera, whether or not you had to impose quarantines. And there was a real attempt to have international agreements between countries and empires, normally at loggerheads with each other. And the mover and shaker was Marcel Proust's father, Adrien Proust. And my first thought was, smile, rose on my old large face. And I thought, father to the most hypochondriac writer in the whole of the history of European literature, I thought. And a figure who I knew he was a doctor, Adrien Proust, and I always thought of him as a figure of fun and, very neurotic about, Marcel's adolescence and everything else. And what I didn't know was he was an extraordinarily powerful, important figure in bringing countries together. And he thought he was the first person who dreamed of some international public health organization. You're seeing him here in 1893 in Venice, as you see, sort of at the end of a successful conference where he managed to get common agreement about what to do to, a common agreement really basically about the establishment of some international public health organization. Didn't come about till 1907. It really blossomed after he died, and it turned into a not very effective League of Nations organization, but that was the essential roots of the WHO. And so it was with, I'll just say one thing more, and I've been burbling on. When you're a writer, and Gabrielle very kindly said, well, there are a lot of characters there, you can have a kind of good purpose in mind, and you know what you want to explore and the questions you want to ask and the arguments you want to, but unless you've got a set of human stories, really, the thing just becomes a kind of seminar on the page. And with Adrien, whose life was rather extraordinary, really, I kind of sat bolt upright, and the kind of writerly gremlin started to kind of, whisper in my ear, essentially.
But then how did you go about finding the other characters? Were you searching for them?
Well, I wrote as a trial thing, I did 2 things. I said to my wonderful wife, we both know I have a raging imposter syndrome, but, it will really explode beyond all reasonable bounds if I dabble in medical history. And she kindly said, I'll read bits of it if you'd like me to. I said I sure would. And she encouraged me, and I subscribed to Lancet, and I did microbiology for dummies. I went back to school. I did everything I really wanted to do. And I didn't think... at that point, I was too cowardly to tell the publishers, you're not getting Return of the Tribes, you're getting something else. I thought it might not be a book at all. And then I wrote the Proust chapter, and there's a little sub-story. When I thought, well, this is a really interesting man, and in a way, public health is an extension of complicated international politics at the time. And I thought, I'm sure somewhere on my bookshelves, and did you see the background? Did we zoom? Or was it?
Oh, yes.
Yes. My study is a kind of byword of chaos, really. But I knew somewhere in there was a little éloge à Antoine Proust. In other words, a kind of post-funeral tribute to him, which I found at a bouquiniste, a bouquiniste, a bookseller, one of those stalls on the banks of the Seine 10, 15 years ago. And I sort of just, it was a curiosity thing. I barely read it at all. I thought, I'm not going to find it. And I did find it. And I opened it. There's a photograph in the book of... I opened it, and inside, on that page, was a sprig of hawthorn. And if any of you have read... even if you've never got beyond volume 1, which I hope you have, Swan's Way to Courtiger's Fun, you'll know that the hawthorn was a kind of magically potent kind of flower for Proust. And I thought, okay, I'm getting kind of strange woo-woo messages from, planet author really sort of out there. And I went ahead, but with all kinds of... And I wrote the Proust chapter first. And he had... he starts life as a physician. He goes through terrible scenes of panic and horror in cholera, which is a violently virulent thing. And he was convinced, there was a big argument going on, that all you had to do with cholera was disinfect the source of fecally tainted water. That's absolutely true, but the not true part about it is all you have to do. Because those who were just thought you just go about, making sure the water is not tainted, particularly the British, said it's not a contagious disease. And remember that still in the 1850s, 60s, there's no real understanding of how toxic, pathogenic microbes really can be transmitted. It all happens really in the 1870s and 80s and 90s. But Proust was convinced that, and he was quite right, that, for example, if the upholstery in a carriage going across Paris was faintly, dirty, soiled, then indeed it could be contagious. It wasn't contagious in the sense in which two people in a room, it wasn't like COVID with respiratory disease could give it to each other, but it sure was. And Proust said, cholera follows people in motion. And he went to the hottest of hotspots for cholera, where it was erupting sort of every other year on the borderline between Russia and Persia. And there's an account that he gave of traveling into the hottest of these hot infectious zones. And, that was, then I thought, okay, I've got to take a crack at this, basically.
So just a quick other question before we get into the meat of the book. How did you do the research in lockdown? Was this an exercise in frustration, or was it? No, it was fantastic, really. I mean, I am one, and always have been, in a sort of rather, spuriously romantic way about actually working with the physical documents. I mean, when I did Rough Crossings, that history book about the enslaved people who were offered freedom if they would fight for the British during the Revolutionary War, and then who were, surprise, not treated very well by the British, but ended up on this extraordinary kind of
crossing of the Atlantic to found what became Sierra Leone. There was a journal of a young naval lieutenant called John Clarkson, the brother of a much more famous abolitionist called Thomas Clarkson, he was a 27-year-old naval officer whose mission it was to bring these people who'd lost the war twice, really, in effect, back to Africa. It was microfilmed, but there was the actual copy. There were two copies. His daughter made one, but this was the original one of the journal, complete with salt water stains from the crossing. It was in New York Historical Society, and they said to me, "Well, just use the microfilm." I said, "I actually have to sit here and turn the pages of the paper." It's just ridiculous, really, and yet not. There is this sort of. And we'll never get through everything we want to do, but I have to tell this story anyway. This is a good story. On my first book, which is called Patriots and Liberators, about the catastrophe that happens to the Dutch when they're ostensibly liberated by the French armies during the French Revolutionary period. And that was my first book, my first big research project, my doctoral work, and I was working away in this gloomy archive in The Hague, and I wanted to see documents that had belonged to a political thinker, really, who was also a soldier, and he'd gone off to fight, and he never made it back from that campaign in 1799. He'd sent a batch of documents to his wife, but she'd died of, we don't know from what, before she got them. So they went straight into the archive, and the seal was still not broken on this little box of documents. And it was his whole world. One was, movingly, 2 tickets to a season of chamber music concerts, including Haydn and C.P. Bach in The Hague. One was a draft for a new constitution for the so-called Batavian Republic. And the third one was a little love letter, really. And you broke, I mean, this is already a very trembly thing. You don't do it yourself, you go to the supervisor, and he breaks the seal. And out came, along with this little beautiful letter to his wife, a lock of hair bound with a pale blue ribbon, bright blue ribbon, because it had never seen the light of day. And it smelled of perfume, of men perfume their hair, particularly when they weren't wearing wigs, of a musky perfume that lasted about a minute, I'd say, before disappearing back into oblivion. So and it was sort of, hair standing back. So I'm in favor of old documents. Anyway, to go back to lockdown, you couldn't do that. However, what you could do is just amazing, because we're going to, if we ever get there too, what's extraordinary is how much you could find in lockdown. People publishing the first statistical data about whether inoculation against smallpox worked, sent to the Royal Society in London. So we're now talking 17, 13, 14, 15, 16. Whatever the many, many genuine sins and vices of the British Empire in India, failing to collect data was not one of them. So you had a huge amount. And the extraordinary thing, as we became more and more confined, and, vaccines for COVID were not yet on the horizon, the more living the kind of virtuality, I don't know if you found that, of the archive seemed to me. I would open my laptop in the morning, and I'd left it at some obscure memorandum on cholera in the tea plantations of Assam, and I could not wait to be connected with all the doctors and the poor people who were suffering. It was very, very vivid and alive, coming through. It was not like bloody Zoom meetings, where you're dealing with simulacrums of ourselves, really. So
let's jump into the book.
Yeah.
So I wanted to chat about some of the themes and the characters that are explored. Let us start with the counterintuitive role of women.
Right. Really important. And can we have one of our women heroes? There she is. This is really extraordinary. And again, I was very happy to find it, but I didn't go looking for it. And this is a woman called Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. I don't know if any of you know her story. Oh, I love it. None of you do. Great. Then you do need to buy the book and read it. She's being painted in Oriental, so-called Turkish dress by the society portraitist Godfrey Kneller. At the time, she became the great promoter and champion for inoculating people against smallpox. Smallpox was, again, like cholera in the 19th century, was an absolutely horrific infectious disease. It killed 1 in 6 people who got it. If you survived, you were likely to be very badly disfigured. Or you could go blind as well. It was another terrible possibility. And it kind of arrived as bubonic plague. The Black Death was sort of ebbing, and not completely at all. It never completely goes away. She had... Nobody knew what to do about it, and her brother had died of smallpox in 1715. She had been a famous beauty, published poet, friend of Alexander Pope and John Gay, and the early 18th century Augustan playwrights. And she'd been very badly disfigured. The painter kindly doesn't show you that. She was the wife of she'd eloped with, as it turned out, a bit of a nebbish, actually, or whatever the early 18th century English version of it, called Edward Wortley Montagu. But he was the British ambassador in Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire, Turkish Empire. So there she is in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire, and she notices, first thing, that no woman in particular is marked by smallpox, and children aren't, and she inquires about this. From the women, they say, well, we've had the little operation. And the little operation was taking pus, sorry about this before supper, from a live infected smallpox sufferer, and then abrading your arm, your forehead, your legs, between your toes, wherever, or making incisions and putting it in there in order to bring on a case of smallpox. Now, this is sort of, it's a given. It's vaccination before cows are involved. But if you think about it, it was the most extraordinarily counterintuitive thing to do, to actually, and when she becomes a promoter, she's accused of being a monstrous mother because she's actually inviting sickness into the body of a perfectly healthy child. She does this to her 6-year-old son, Edward, while her husband is away with the Sultan, I have to say. Just significant, I think. And she has a wonderful correspondence with her friends saying, I'm going to do this. I know, I have faith. And it works. He has a little fever. He has only 3 little pustules, scabs fall off. He's fine. She does it to her 3-year-old when she gets back to England. And because she's a kind of known society, literary celebrity, she persuades the then Princess of Wales, who becomes Queen Caroline, to do it to the royal family. And this is, and she has a huge kind of storm of fury from clergy who say it's in God's hand whether people will live or die of smallpox, and how could you possibly be so unnatural, word used? And thirdly, why would you take the kind of, why would you take a lesson from ignorant and scarcely literate foreigners? That was sort of put exactly that way, who are not even Christian. And she storms back again, and it takes a while for inoculation to catch on. But what's really amazing is that the Royal Society, this sort of a rather august body of, Western scientists and physicians, are prepared to listen to it, partly because they'd already had 2 reports from Greek doctors working in Turkey that this does in fact work. But what then happens through the management of an amazing, a sort of hero of statistics called James Durin, who's the secretary of the Royal Society, is a sort of systematic collation of data about to see whether or not inoculation did have the effect that Mary thought. And through the whole story, really, women as mothers, really, I think, actually, especially, have extraordinary kind of faith in science and are very often at the forefront. I mean, no sooner than women have crashed through the barred doors of medical education in the 1860s and 70s, then they go off to the most dangerous, epidemiologically hazardous places like India and China and so on.
I want to know what her husband thought of it when he learned.
Yeah, I mean, history does not record that, but he certainly doesn't go. The marriage kind of peters out. I mean, but they don't separate or anything, and there's no record of him being shocked by it. And it was a big thing because little Edward is, the son and heir, really.
Yeah. Let's turn to Hafkin.
Right.
So maybe you could just introduce us to him.
I can. Can we have his? Somebody said he looks just like. There he is. Incredible photo. Someone said, Liam Neeson is already auditioning. Vladimir Hafkin's extraordinary. This was done in 1899 at the moment of his brief celebrity in England. He was celebrated as, in the words of Florence Nightingale, aged, was a great champion. Joseph Lister, the kind of pioneer of antiseptics, admired him enormously, called him the savior of mankind. He actually is the person who produces things that was thought couldn't be done, a vaccine against cholera, and then a vaccine against bubonic plague. Bubonic plague comes roaring back into the world, starting in Canton and Hong Kong, Guangzhou, as it is now, in 1892. But it kills 30 million people between the 1890s and the late 1920s. And it's sort of been forgotten. We remember Spanish flu, basically because it was an Asian horror. Touches down in California and in Australia, but not as seriously as in Asia. So Hafkin is this, he's a Ukrainian Jew, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism of a kind of aristocratic sniggering behind your hand kind, but there's a lot of philo-Semitism in Britain at the end of the 19th century. And if you're familiar with George Eliot's wonderful novel, Danny Doronda, will know about that. And so he's sort of seen somehow as the good Jewish doctor. He's actually not a doctor, he's an experimental scientist. But he carries an air of the kind of romance of pioneering around with him. We can have the next picture. The photograph, by the way, was taken by, again, very interesting woman called Angelina Ackland, who's the daughter of the Oxford professor of pathology, retired, and who's the first, as far as I can tell, the first photographer to experiment with technology of color photography, actually. Yeah, not with pictures of him. Here he is as a student in 1884 in Odessa. He's an Odessa Ukrainian Jew from Odessa. You probably know as one of the only place where Jews could go to a university and learn law or science or mathematics or whatever. And he comes from a kind of not completely secular but not ultra-Orthodox family. He fetches up in Odessa University in 1879 to read maths and physics, but he becomes rather bewitched by two things. One, by the extraordinary biologist, microbiologist, Elie Metchnikoff, who gets the Nobel Prize for really demonstrating for the first time how the immune system works. But he's also a very radical figure. He joins student politics, and he is part of a small group of students who arm the Jewish community in Odessa against pogroms. And he's caught 3 times carrying a gun on his person and locked up. And Metchnikoff, his doctor Vada, has connections in Petersburg. He's a converted Jew. And even though a big dossier of the security police is started on Hafkin in Petersburg, he's somehow rescued from prison. But Metchnikoff, after the 3rd time, says, I can't go on doing this. My own position is getting, correct about that, compromised. And you have to concentrate on science. So he kind of gives up this dangerous life. And when Metchnikoff goes to the Pasteur Institute in his first years in Paris, he brings Hafkin with him. in a very lowly position. There was really no proper science job for him, but he's an assistant librarian. And then the person who prepares the experimental equipment and experimental animals for the first course of microbiology taught in the world goes off to be a ship's doctor suddenly in Vietnam. Hafkeen steps into that role, and he works for 2.5 years, thanklessly and in many moments of despair, as he told an audience later, almost to the point of suicidal despair. And he produces finally a cholera vaccine which demonstrably works. And if none of you, I don't think anyone gets cholera vaccines anymore, there's oral medication. But if you go, when I started filming in India 30 years ago almost actually, then you did get a cholera vaccine, which is pretty much what, based on Hafkeen's methodology.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can you pull out, before we move to India,
Right.
a bit more about this theme of the good Jew and the not?
Right. He's an outsider, and I think that the Pasteur Institute it's very interesting because at the time when really, you suddenly have these revelations of what a pathogenic microbe was. You can actually see them under, revolutionized microscopy. There is a lot of kind of nationalist or imperialist competition about who's going to be the first to isolate the pathogens responsible for typhus or typhoid, or diphtheria in particular is very important. That also but there are only two places that are really working intensively. One is Robert Koch's laboratory, Koch's laboratory in Berlin, and the other one is the Pasteur Institute. And both places are open to scientists who come from kind of almost everywhere. So actually, to be a kind of interested outsider is a good thing in these institutes, but a liability when you're trying to vaccinate large populations and you run up against governments that don't yet believe they believe in vaccination for smallpox that had been demonstrated for nearly a century, but smallpox is no longer an issue. They don't believe it they think the dangers and risks are much more serious. And they all have a stake, the empires in particular, both the French and the British, have a stake in saying to their imperial subject populations, we're not interested in any claims you want to make for political independence, but we can guarantee that you'll have a more prosperous and materially safer life under the benevolent rule of us white folk. And when this doesn't, when these empires have an onslaught of famines and then seem to be defenseless, particularly against the plague, this suddenly, do you go with these new experimental scientists or don't you? And mostly they don't want to hear about it, actually.
So let's go to India.
Yeah.
And I wanted to start there by hearing about Hafkeen's ability to get dirty and
Right.
go
That is
into
it.
the slums and understand the importance of persuasion.
Yeah. Here's a picture of Hafkeen. What happens to Valdemar is that he I should say it's very important that when he develops the cholera vaccine, he inoculates himself sort of in public, really, basically, at least in a public meeting of the Pasteur Institute and the Paris Biological Society. So he is the first volunteer, and he's fine. Then he rounds up his very trusting gang of Russian, French friends, so 60 of them. Everything works out fine for the cholera vaccine. But he knows that really cholera is ebbing in Europe, not completely, but it is ebbing. And if you're actually going to do what we now recognize to be a randomized clinical trial, in other words, you have a population of all of whom inhabit basically the same social circumstances, and you have person A gets the vaccine, person B does not, person C does, and then you see what the difference is. It's got to be done in a population where the disease you're operating with is. And India is very interesting and complicated because actually some parts of India cholera is actually endemic, and therefore there's a good degree of herd immunity. But in other areas, particularly crowded city spaces, it's epidemic and very, very dangerous. And Calcutta is one of them. This is a picture taken of Hafkin in 1894. It looks like a village. It's not. It's one of the so-called bustis. These are essentially slums in open spaces in Calcutta, in the heart of Calcutta, actually, surprisingly. Some still exist. And here you can see he's at work, dressed to the nines. He was an incredible dandy. When he's going on these extraordinary odysseys into the heart of poorest parts of India, and he's thinking about, I've got to have a supply of lab animals that will make the supply of vaccine, and I need a boatman here and there and so on, and lodgings. He always makes sure he's got a regular supply of black silk socks, actually, as well, happening. So here he is. You can see there's one doctor behind him, a scientist called William Simpson, who's great, his first real champion. He is held at arm's length. The British government is not supporting him in any way. The person who gets him to India is the ex-viceroy, a man called Viscount Dufferin, who is very interested in the obligations of the British Empire towards the public health of its subjects, and his wife was very interested in female medical education, and he was British ambassador in Paris at the time that Hafkin develops cholera vaccine. That's why he's in India. But he's given a kind of passe-partout saying, kindly give Mr. Hafkin, and he was always, correctly, he had a PhD. He was not a physician. He had no medical degree. He had very distinguished, put it mildly, scientific doctorate. But the establishment of the British medics in India thought, he's Russian, he's Jewish, he's not a doctor. Can we have that picture back? Thank you. And here, rather crucially, as Gabrielle implies, he's not only working with very poor people, but you'll see to his right, to the left of the picture as you're looking at it, a group of Indian doctors. You can see 4 of them. The one with the beard is a Parsi who's chief Indian medical officer, which meant he didn't have a lot of power in Calcutta. The other 2 doctors there are they're assistants who are trained by, and we know about them from Hafkin's diary, who were both acting as interpreters, but also trained in safe vaccination. And you can see rather wonderfully, gathered around. Look at that woman in the front, sitting in front of the desk, and her scared children. There's a lot of kind of fear and apprehensiveness and trouble written on their faces. What's safe? What's not safe? So they are going through this. Should we allow our children? They're all volunteers. Hafkin made a point. Vaccination was absolutely never imposed on anyone at all. So they were encouraged by both himself and his Indian assistants to do this. And he embarks on this extraordinary epic odyssey of thousands of miles into the very poorest parts of Punjab, into Gujarat, which again, very, very poor part of India. And this is really, he is a kind of white Russian Ukrainian Jew. But he always understood very early on that, in effect, I suppose you call it the psychology of persuasion or the politics of persuasion, nothing would work unless you did that. He was in Bombay when he worked with a plague vaccine. He knew that you had to persuade religious leaders of communities. He worked with the young Aga Khan, the head of the Ismaili community in Bombay. We've got a picture, actually much further on, haven't we? But he worked with the Ismaili community, and the Aga Khan gets his family vaccinated against bubonic plague, and then much of the Khoja Ismaili community, which is about 30,000 strong in Mumbai now, follows. So he's very unusually thinking like a sociologist almost.
Right. And how important was that these vaccines weren't imposed on the people?
It made the difference between, we're now, and we're going to talk about this in a bit if we have time, about the politics, the rhetoric of actually the acceptability of vaccines has become incredibly weaponized between those who think vaccine mandates for health workers is a form of destruction of American individual liberties.
But did he foresee that almost?
Yes, I think he did. Yeah. I think he did. I mean, and eventually the British, maybe we can whistle through a few of the images. How's our time going?
No, that sounds good. You want to go through the next images?
Yeah, I think so, because actually the British instinct is to fight the last war epidemiologically. So they're very heavily into almost military-style disinfection. And which was an important, but not a completely important, vaccination against cholera. So when bubonic plague hits a huge city like Bombay, above all the poorest parts of Bombay, what you did was sort of basically you first of all had to discover who's infected with buboes, which meant what was regarded as intolerable immodesty. Buboes arise in the groin and under the armpits, and there's a shortage of women doctors. So even though it may not be white people doing the examination, it's going to be incredibly upsetting, traumatic almost, for the modesty of poor Indian women to do this. And what happened was, this is a picture extraordinary from a volume of photographs. I didn't discover them, but it's not widely known, called The Plague, again, another appealing title, The Plague Visitation Album. It's actually called that. And it was done by a military photographer called Claude Moss. There were two photographers, actually. I think this is done by a man called Francis Stewart, who was more of a society photographer, slightly different format. And it was designed as a kind of it wasn't going to be published, but it was going to be circulated in limited numbers. Only 4 copies survive, as a sort of exercise in imperial medical self-congratulation. And this is, as you can see, they're starting off in the morning. There are soldiers lined up. They're going to inspect houses for families who might be affected by bubonic plague. When that happens, then family members are separated, the infected are sent off to plague hospitals and to sort of internment camps, open-air internment camps. People are taken off trains and inspected on platforms. And not surprisingly, there's a huge kind of distressed blowback. Can we go to the next picture? You can see some of the other things that happen. And they're, just houses are, you can see, houses are just flattened because they're thought to be irrevocably contaminated with bubonic plague. Nobody yet understands. The discovery of the bubonic plague bacillus had happened by Alexandre Yersin in Hong Kong just 2 years before, was by no means accepted, as it was still thought that rotting organic matter might cause the Black Death. So a whole little community of slums is destroyed. You can see these are migrant people at the top. This is the original kind of 1896 captions there. Widows and orphans. Coolies means migrant laborers. They're mostly from Gujarat and the Deccan Plateau. Incredibly poor people, suffering terribly. They're all their menfolk are dead. At a converted slaughterhouse. And what happens about the photographic album is it goes, can we have the next one? It starts and then it ends. The last photograph, Claude Moss, who must have been a good-hearted person, the more he sort of basically goes, his heart goes into these poor communities. So we lose an array of photographs of starched hat nurses who are also courageous and doing a proper job. And we end up with this incredible picture of the Sidi family, S-I-D-I, who are the descendants of enslaved people who were taken by Arab slave traders from the coast of East Africa to Gujarat, West India, to serve as house servants. And then before Bombay is a big city, and then become part of the dockyard population. But I suspect with his little uniform, he is actually still a house servant, and the little boy is dead. He's maybe 9 or 10 years old. And it's a shocking and upsetting picture because clearly they've been paid something to pose. And you can see the grave is at the foreground of the photo, into which their little boy is going to be interred, dropped. And they hate having to pose, don't they? I mean, I don't know if they hate it, but it's a heartbreaking picture, I think. And apart from the heartbreak, what happens as this kind of ruthless sort of campaign of disinfection goes on is that it causes trouble. There are strikes and riots in 1897 in June, on the very day of the celebration of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. The public health senior officer in Pune, about 200 kilometers east of Bombay, is assassinated. And Hafkin, who'd not really been listened to very much, says, we have a plague vaccine, which is a prophylactic, which actually has already demonstrably in trial populations, referring to the Aga Khan's Muslims, to the Jewish community in Bombay. He's adopted, interestingly, by some of the Indian aristocracy. And so, again, all volunteers, although I suspect persuaded a bit by their elders to do this. So he has data to say this prophylactic works, you'll see it works. And if you do this, it can actually avoid the most, this catastrophic consequence and and the dangers to your authority, in effect. And he sets up we have the next picture. Eventually, the British believe him, eventually. And there he is actually vaccinating on the street in Mumbai. You can see him. He's in, I said, pith helmet. He's the figure doing the vaccination. You can tell from the fine tailoring and the polished shoes. And then I want you to you can just see under the umbrella parasol, there is a woman doctor, wonderful woman we know a bit about, called Alice Courthorne, who is a classic example of a young woman doctor, comes out into the most dangerous places. She actually has a vaccination buggy, which she takes round to people who have agreed to be vaccinated. And then Hafkin is set up in Government House, finally, in the summer of 1899. Next picture. And this is the world's first mass production vaccination facility. So rather amazing, actually, but not an uncomplicated story.
Let's fast forward to the end of his life.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about this drawn-out tragedy, if you will?
Right. It's producing the facility at Parel, which is now called the Hafkin Institute, the only place in the world where he's really recognized and by a named institute. And it goes great guns. It produces 2-3 million doses in 3 years or something, and it starts with a staff of 53, which only expands to 260 or 70 or something. We should have had thousands. But it makes an extraordinary difference in the most impoverished and susceptible parts of India. And then in 1902, something very bad happens. In a village in the Punjab called Malkawal, 19 people die from contaminated batch of plague vaccine from tetanus poisoning. And Hafkin is immediately blamed for it. There's a commission of inquiry. It's thought that he remained faithful to a principle of the Pasteur Institute protocols about sterilization, which indispensably involved heat. The British view was that you didn't necessarily need heat. You used a dilute version of carbolic acid, and that was good enough. It sounds ridiculous, but this was sort of almost kind of nationalist sterilization competition. And Hafkin had changed the protocols because he really had serious doubts about whether carbolic acid would do it. And also, it slowed down the whole procedure of producing vaccines, and he was in a hurry as terrible demands are being made on the facility. And then in Malkawal, these people die, and the immediate judgment said, well, he's mucked around with the official protocols and all the stuff. The then Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, who was not particularly, hugely disposed towards Jews, said, well, Hafkeen should be tried, convicted, and hanged for what he'd done to the credibility of the British Empire. Hafkeen knew that something must have happened not at the facility, but in the village itself. Why? Because it took about 2-3 weeks to get to, or had taken 2-3 weeks for this particular batch 53 to get to its destination where this catastrophe happened. And invariably, when tetanus toxin begins to grow in a culture, when you open the stopper, a very violent odor would hit you, and nobody had had any of that experience at all. And there were other reasons too, but that was a really important one. And it turned out to be the case that what actually happened in the village was that the preparer of the syringes had actually used a forceps to extract the India upper stopper from the bottle of vaccine, and he dropped the forceps on the ground. These vaccinations always took place in the open in villages where else they can do them. And he'd sluiced the forceps in a bowl of carbolic acid, but had not passed it through a spirit flame. And that's what had happened. That caused these fatalities. But Hafkeen was fired. He was fired. He was basically held completely responsible for this. There were some deputies at the lab who were not that happy with his authority anyway. They particularly felt he was too emotional to, all the things that are said about kind of touchy-feely, hysterical, neurotic Jews were said about Valdemar. And they felt there were one particular man who became, in effect, in charge of the facility, a man called Bannerman. So he goes back to England. He tries to explain the scientific basis of his doubts. Doesn't really get anywhere until an amazing figure, another rather maverick scientist called Ronald Ross, who was the person responsible for connecting Anopheles mosquitoes, locating that as the vector of malaria, suspects, with the help of William Simpson, the other white doctor you saw in the Calcutta cholera vaccination photo, they know some sort of miscarriage of justice has happened. And as the information becomes apparent, the committees of inquiries who'd said, yes, Hafkeen's responsible, start to kind of back off in a rather, because they knew, but they didn't really want to admit they'd made this terrible error. And in 1907, Ross and Simpson, but particularly Ross, who's the first professor of tropical medicine at Liverpool University, write these absolutely sort of j'accuse, ferocious letters to the Times, to the Manchester Guardian, to Nature, to Lancet, and the evidence is irrefutable, and eventually Hafkeen is vindicated. But he's sort of broken in a way which is really upsetting when you were in the archive. He's given a job back in India, but a kind of very minimally financed lab in the grounds of Calcutta General Hospital. And he's kept away from any vaccine production of any kind. And he felt that and knew it. And there's a kind of really upsetting exchange of correspondence where Ross writes to him, he's back in Calcutta, Hafkeen, and says, well, it's wonderful you've got your job back, and justice has prevailed. And Hafkeen says, well, I wish that were, I'm paraphrasing, I wish that were true, but actually nothing's changed. Nobody really wants to talk to me. They still hold me responsible for this. And his life as a scientist is over, really. He's 48. He dies in Lausanne. He becomes a very religious Jew and interested in Orthodox Jewish religious education. He had not been a religious Jew when he was younger. There's one photo which I have in the book at the end, which is very poignant to me. It's the last picture in our, if we can have it. Yeah, there. and you'll notice the blurry face, right? So this is 1908. He's back in India. An outbreak of cholera, that old enemy, comes in, particularly hits the mining community of coal miners in a place called Jaria, about 150 miles west of Calcutta. And they're only Afghan students in Calcutta and Agra in particular have access to a supply of cholera vaccine. But the British authorities do not want Afghan. They regard him basically still as sort of under a cloud. And they're certainly not prepared to have Indian doctors go off to Jaria and start inoculating people against cholera. So Afghan, in sort of desperation, goes himself. He has no assistance. He has a supply of, thanks to his students and their lab animals, has a supply of cholera vaccine. And he goes and inoculates. The miners are many are dying in their thousands. Some have fled. The families are terrified. The mining company is losing all its labor. So it too wants inoculation. And here he is doing it. And the photograph is taken by the health inspector of the mines, who is clearly not an accomplished photographer, does not quite understand shutter speeds or exposure. And so he's done what I call, it's not strictly true, a double exposure. And I wonder at the end, you can see one of the Afghan faces is intent on delivering, because he was actually nervous about the condition and safety of the vaccines. And the other is looking at the camera reluctantly with kind of trouble and worry and perhaps a little anger on his face. And I speculate, and every time I see this photograph, I change my mind. Which came first? Was he grudgingly giving the photographer a chance to look and then goes back to work, or is he the other way around? And we'll never know.
Let's go up to modern day. So many of the pieces in these photos are reminiscent of today. The worry on that mother's face about whether to vaccinate the kid, and the government's role and strategy. Talk to me. I mean, vaccines are still a live issue in politics today. How does this history? Is it replaying itself? Are these the same threads? Is it new?
I mean, I was very conscious through the whole thing that, particularly when we did have vaccines, and also the kind of irresponsibility of mostly right-wing, although, we have two candidates now running essentially on anti-vaccination programs. Robert Kennedy, who used to live near us as riverkeepers in the Hudson Valley, and who still swears by this totally discredited theory that the vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella, which we will give to our children, and is responsible for autism. There is no evidence that's been debunked for like 25 years. And then there's Ron DeSantis, who has become more and more, including his Surgeon General, educated at Harvard Medical School, which doesn't say a whole lot for that institution, who told people who were not over 65, do not get the booster. It's actually not a booster. I hope you all... how many of you know people who've got COVID now or just had it recently? Yeah, I mean, a fair number of you. Right, I hope you're all fine now. But those of you who don't, please do go and get it. It's a new vaccine, actually. It's not a booster. It's actually a monovalent targeted to descendants of Omicron, which is a very good thing. It's pretty much in the way in which flu vaccines change from year to year to year, depending on the kind of viral structure and so on. So what I guess I find so dispiriting is the kind of weaponization and the rhetoric. The first and last chapters of the book are set in COVID. The last chapter in particular deals with what I call Fauci phobia. And I didn't, through the book, I didn't want to clunkily make those analogies with now, but you trust exactly, you, Gabrielle, and any reader will absolutely hear it coming through loud and clear, the sort of sense in which really vaccination can be a kind of conspiracy, that actually you're better off trusting your own common sense, as the Surgeon General of Florida said. That he was the one who has his medical degree from Harvard. And this extraordinary sense, which was really, I guess, the deep, leitmotif of the book, and which is just a sort of general historical observation that, we at the same time, the human condition is a great miraculous triumph of scientific ingenuity that come up with messenger RNA vaccines and the older technology of vaccines in an unbelievably short time. And we're also, our same human beings are a kind of cartload of barely evolved bundles of paranoia, mania, belief in ivermectin, and hydroxychloroquine. I mean, I was beginning to say, that was unbelievably irresponsible of Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham and the rest of them on Fox. And, there was a whole procession, do you remember, of right-wing radio chat hosts, each of which died over a period of about a year, having ranted against the conspiracy of vaccines being foisted on you. So it seems, we're faced now. I mean, I guess, again, the other, without sounding sort of ludicrously sententious, when you're getting to be an old geezer, as I've got to be an old geezer, there was a wonderful thing, actually, I loved. My wife hated this, but I thought it was quite funny. In the British newspaper, there's a very good young historian called David Olusoga who does television. And it said, David Olusoga is the face of BBC history now that Simon Schama is nearing 80. And there was that wonderful scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where Terry Jones is on a kind of play cart and he goes, "I'm not dead yet." I'm not dead yet either. And my wife is furious about it. But there is the sense, when you do get to an age, you can do two things. You can either go on to kind of cruise control. You invite your readers to walk down memory lane, do more Tudors, and absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. The only wrong thing with history is to convert it into an exercise of endless self-congratulation. It becomes the genealogy of the wonderfulness of us. Or do what history has been doing since Thucydides, and that's, a kind of very unsparing self-critical examination. So I did, with what nearing 80 and all the rest of it, I absolutely felt history I want to write is something that's wired to the existential problems which are coming at us, like a kind of meteor shower, really. And so that I think is why I stayed with the whole project, and I'm happy to have written it.
So one last question. This paradox you've pulled out of our ingenuity and also our hopelessness.
Right.
Is there any solution, or is there movement towards some better?
Well, I think and I miss my wife not being here, the scientist, because she would agree with me and people like Richard Dawkins and all sorts of very, very good David, Wallace Wells, people like that, works for the New York Times or did, I'm not sure if he still does, but David Quammen, for example, fantastic writer, journalist, but, a very hardcore, serious scientific writer who wrote a magnificent book called Breathless, and an even better book about the relationship between wild animal populations and the appearance of waves of infectious diseases. I can't recommend that book highly enough. It's called Spillover. And so it needs a mixture of education and a kind of adamant belief in the authority of science, and great writing, great communication, and those things have to absolutely come together. Boston is a good place to say that, one of the crises that we're facing more generally, whether it's about climate change or epidemiology or many other things, is a challenge to the sovereignty of knowledge itself. And it's very dramatic in the United States, I think, because it kind of always has been. If you think about actually the way the Republic was founded, on the one hand, there is whatever his many vices, the ultimate philosopher, politician, Thomas Jefferson, wants to know everything about everything. And you have the Great Awakening, too, in which belief and revelation and your wired connection between you and the Almighty and your heart is always going to triumph over the interesting but ultimately inferior realm of cerebration. And this is our kind of national split personality. And it was stuck with it, but also that can be cynically weaponized. Donald Trump is Donald Trump. There is no excuse for Josh Hawley or J.D. Vance or Ted Cruz, Harvard graduates, J.D. Vance, a Yale graduate, who know what knowledge is and who know the difference between truth and falsehood and nonsensical drivel and hard-earned informed wisdom. But there is a percentage to actually siding with the barely evolved, with siding with messianic conspiracy theories. And they are the people I would put in the dock. I'd love to see them share a cell with Donald Trump. Serve them both right. On that characteristically calm note. Oops.
He's not dead yet.
No. I might be after that, though, soon,
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Sir Simon Schama. We'll be signing books out in the lobby. Our next CitySpace event, which I think this crowd will like, is we have the New York Times book critic, one of my favorites, Dwight Garner, discussing his new memoir, The Upstairs Delicatessen, on eating, reading, reading about eating, and eating while reading, with Robin Young. And yes, we will be serving some of his favorite foods, so you can be eating while listening and listening while eating. Sign up for our events. You can go to our QR code right here and see what's coming. Please join Simon Schama in the lobby. Thank you both.